ghetto von Ghetto zu Ghetto, und kennet gefunden kein Ort. Nicht so ist mein Biber, wie trockt man a Biber, Menschen und sagt heute Wort. Es leucht auf mein Helmit, der Himmel, der Bläue, woher hab ich jetzt davon? Ich steh wie ein Bettler bei etweden teuer und bettel a bissele Sonn. Frühling, nimm zu mein Treue und bring mein Liebsten, mein Tränen zurück. Frühling, auf deine Fliege Bläue, oh, nimm mein Herz mit und bring es zu mein Glück. Frühling, auf deine Fliege Bläue, oh, nimm mein Herz mit und bring es zu mein Glück. Ich geh zu der Arbeit vorbei unser Stiefel, ein Treuer, der teuer vermacht. Der Tag hat zerhälter, die Blumen verwelkte, seit Jahren verseh ich euch nach. Vernacht auf zurückweg, es neuet der Treue, und da hast du liebster gewahrt. Und da in dem Schotten noch kennt ich dein Trottis. Fleckst kuschen mich lieblich und es zart. Frühling, nimm zu mein Treue und bring mein Liebsten, mein Tränen zurück. Frühling, auf deine Fliege Bläue, oh, nimm mein Herz mit und bring es zu mein Glück. Frühling, auf deine Fliege Bläue, oh, nimm mein Herz mit und bring es zu mein Glück. Jahr der Frühling gur früh und gekommen, zerblüht hat sich Bänkschaft noch dir. Ich seh dir wie der Balladen mit Blumen, a Freidücke gehst du zu mir. Die Sonne hat vergossen dem Garten mit Strand, zersprotzt hat die Erde dich im Grün. Mein Liebster, mein Freier, wo bist du verfallen? Du gehst mit heraus von mein Sinn. Frieden, nimm zu mein Treue und bring meine Liebsten, mein Tränen zurück. Frieden, auf deine Fliege Bläue, oh, nimm mein Herz mit und bring es zu mein Glück. Frühling, auf deine Fliege Bläue, oh, nimm mein Herz mit und bring es zu mein Glück.
Welcome everyone in person. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs at YIVO, and we're so thrilled to have you here tonight. And also welcome to the over 100 people that are streaming on Zoom or on YouTube. We're really pleased to be celebrating Meryl Frank's new book, Unearthed. Before I hand it over to these two for tonight's conversation, just a very brief word about YIVO. YIVO is a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archives and a library with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books. which are used by researchers around the world, including by Meryl, for this book. So we're especially pleased to be able to celebrate this tonight. We also have a variety of public programs like this, and classes, including a special focus on the Yiddish language, and exhibitions, and more to bring the world of our collections and of Jewish history and Jewish culture to life. I want to thank the Center for Jewish History and the Forward for co-sponsoring tonight's program. And I want to let you all know that after the Q&A portion of the evening, we will have books for sale and a signing in the hall. And we have some wines. We hope you'll join us. Meryl Frank is a member of the board of YIVO. She's the president of the Makeda Global Network, an international consulting firm that works with thousands of women worldwide. Over a long and varied career, she's been an activist, a mayor, an ambassador, and a champion for women's leadership and political participation around the world. In 2009, President Obama appointed her United States representative and subsequently ambassador to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. In May 2022, President Biden appointed Frank to a seat on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council. Joining us as well is Laura E. Adkins, an award-winning writer, editor, and speaker based here in New York. She's the opinion editor of The Forward, and her writing on anti-Semitism, Orthodox Judaism, gender, and more has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Glamour, and other outlets. She was previously the opinion editor of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency and the editor of Jewish Insider, and an assistant blogs editor at the Times of Israel. Please join me in welcoming Laura and Meryl.
Thanks so much for having us tonight. I'm glad we have good attendance online and in person. It's really nice to see. Meryl, this is such a gripping story, and even though it's not fiction, it reads like a novel in a lot of places. And the level of detail that you add to the story of your family, one might assume, had they not read your bio, that you have a background in Holocaust research or are the child of survivors. But in fact, this is not your professional background. You're a child of the generation that followed the survivors, but not the direct descendant. What is your connection to the Holocaust, both personally and through this journey, and why did you write this book?
Well, my connection, can you hear me? Yes. My connection is lifelong. It started, I think, at birth when my family saw me as kind of the memorial candle, as the person that would carry on the story. You might think, well, why would you choose a baby? I was named for my grandmother, Meryl, who was from Vilna. And she was a large character in their imagination. And my aunt, her daughter, was the one in the family who inherited from her the stories. My aunt went to Vilna in 1932 and met the entire family and was, I believe she was traumatized by it. And her way of dealing with it was to tell me the stories and to assure that the next generation and the following generation would know about it. And I was just a little kid. I would pop M&Ms and she would be telling me stories, but I remembered everything that she said. And I would go through the photos. Some of them were here. The family photos, you saw some of them, they're very stiff and stern looking. But there was Franya, there was my cousin Franya, the actress, and she was alive. And she was, as you can see, she was beautiful and sexy and interesting. And she captivated my imagination. She enchanted me. And so I wanted to know what happened. And they would tell me about Vilna, about the street that they lived on, about what they would wear, all the stories a family tells. But when they got to the war, everything stopped. And they would just say, they're all gone, they didn't make it. And so I knew, Nazis were bad guys, those kind of things, and Hitler was a really bad guy. But I didn't really know details, so I started doing my own research, maybe when I was a teenager, and dug into it until I learned as much as I could about it. I even studied, as an undergraduate, I studied history and I studied 20th century Eastern European history. So I did have a sense of what it was. And even though they didn't talk about it, it stayed with me. It was such a deep connection that I thought about it every day. You know, it was part of my life and part of what I spoke to my own children about. You know, something that my parents didn't speak to me about.
There are so many artifacts within this book that become characters themselves. Of course, one is the forbidden book, 21 and 1, that you weren't allowed to read. You didn't read. I won't spoil the ending, but you didn't read for a very long time. But also, we opened with the photos. You described growing up with a lot of these photo albums and flipping through them, and you also uncovered a tremendous amount during your research. What was that process, both for you transitioning from your childlike relationship with those photos to taking on the project? How did your relationship with those photos evolve and change? And what was the process then of looking for more out from there like?
Well, you're right. The objects really carried a lot of weight in my family. My grandfather made kettles that they brought over from Europe, and there is a whole story with that, and the jewelry. So the objects that people held in their hand were very meaningful to hand down through the generations, the heirlooms. And so they had all of those stories, you know, weaved into them. The photographs, the way that this moved along was that my aunt, as you mentioned, gave me this book and said, I want you to keep this, I want you to hand it down to your children, but don't ever read it. And she was a formidable character, and if she said not to do something, you don't do it, even if she was dead. So I didn't read it. And I needed to do the research on my own. So I thought, I'm not going to read this book, but I'm going to find out what happened to Franya. And that meant doing the research in the archives. And one of the places, the most important places, was right here at YIVO. At YIVO, they have a collection of documents that were buried beneath the earth of the ghetto. They understood that they had to keep their cultural heritage, that this was important. My own theory is that one of them, I happen to know she was a theater historian. My theory is that the reason that the theater documents are there is because of her. And she happened to be the one who also did the cover of 21 and 1. When I came here, I was able to find Franya's Actors Union card. This is it. Right here, this is from the YIVO archives. I was able to find her in plays that she performed in, posters of fellow actors, correspondence, tremendous amount of information right here. The other place where I was able to find another entire cache of information were in the archives in Vilna. And there, you know, these are things that we have access to now. There were her applications for passports. And with them, I could track where she was performing in what countries and when. I was able to find correspondence and census data and when she was married at my grandparents' house. So all of this information is there. It means spending the time. You know, I thought it was going to be 2 years. I gave myself 2 years to do this research, and it ended up being 7 years. The other thing about it is you have to be dogged in your research because everything is coming online now. That means that I can look today for Franya Winters and find a certain amount of information, and tomorrow or the next day, they will have put more on. I think much of it is the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. They have people in these archives translating it and putting it online. And so you have to check over and over and over, even for the same thing. But it meant being committed to it.
Yeah. So much of this story to me is really about connection, intergenerationally and with specific relatives. And you write very movingly about your relationship with your grandmother that you never met. And you describe this very rich, deep love and longing and connection with her, despite not having met her. And I'm curious how your relationship with other people, both from that generation and your parents' generation, how your relationship with them changed the more that you found connection through the process of researching this book and finding out the ending to this story.
Well, even as a child, I always had a connection with older people. I didn't know my grandmother. She was Meryl. But I was told that I was like her. I was a tzatzkala like her. She was the youngest of 5 daughters. I was the youngest of 4. And I just had this sense, I think it may have been imposed because I was named for her. My 3 sisters have American names, and I have a Yiddish name. I loved her, and my mother told me, I didn't realize this, she told me when I was little I would cry because I didn't know her. Because she said I would say that I missed her. So there was this very, very strong connection. And also my other cousins, I have 2 cousins who were survivors. And I was very, very close to both of them. So this sense that I could learn from my relatives, my older relatives, was very important. And at the same time, I had a sense that I needed to be sunshine for them, that I could make them happy. And so my 2 cousins that were survivors, I never spoke to them about what happened to them because I didn't want to cause them any pain, and I wanted to make them happy all of the time. And now I think, why didn't I ask them? But
yeah. There was a line, I think in chapter 11 of your book, where you said about one relative who survived but never spoke of it, silence was the only way he could bear to live the rest of his life. And that line really stuck with me. You also talk about this idea, you framed it very well. You say that in your family you fell between either silence or obsession when it came to the Holocaust, and you see them as 2 sides of the same coin, and you tried to find the balance between the 2. What does that mean to you? Say more about that relationship between the 2.
well, I think that there was a generation that was silent, and there's very good reasons for it. I think it's painful for people to talk about it, to find the words to describe their lives. My cousins are very good examples. They didn't speak about it. But I think that we need to. I think that it's important that we speak about it, and that we look at our children and think, okay, do we want to tell them about horror? Do we want to give them some trauma? And, in a weird way, I say some fear is a good thing. It's a good thing because it means that they will know that the world isn't always a beautiful place, that there are dangers, and that they need to watch out for that, and also call it out when it happens. So I think, I fall on the side of speaking about it. Of course, I'm not of that generation, just as you said. I think there's a difference with time and with the removal. Still, there are people that did go through the Holocaust, that are survivors, that will not speak about it, and those that will stand up and tell their stories, and it's just so important to hear it.
Yeah, when thinking about that transmission from the silence to the meaning making, there was a story, you told me this anecdote before your book was, well before the book was out, the story of the Nazi game. And I think that really encapsulates a lot of my generation's relationship to this trauma. Tell us about the Nazi game.
Well, this was after I found out what happened to Franya, and I wanted to know, what did my children think? Because my children grew up in a house where I talked about the Holocaust all the time. And I talked about it in context and out of context. We'd be walking down the street in New York, and I'd say, do you realize Native Americans were here, and they're all gone, and it was a genocide? And my husband said to me, all you ever talk about is the Holocaust. And it's true. It was my life. And so I wanted to interview my kids. I have 4 grown kids. And it was very interesting what they said, because my daughters told me that they played the Holocaust game or the Nazi game when they were kids. And they would take their stuffed animals and hide underneath the blankets and say, hide, hide, they're coming, they're going to get us. And when they told me that, I was horrified. I thought that I had like damaged my beautiful babies, and what kind of mother was I? This horrible person. And all 4 of them said, no, no, no. My daughter said this was like a boogeyman game. It's the way little kids deal with things they're afraid of. But they said that, all 4 of them said that I didn't traumatize them. They weren't paranoid people, but they were aware that what happened because of growing up in this sort of atmosphere was they knew that that things can happen, that again, the world isn't always a beautiful place, and they have to be aware of injustice against Jews, certainly, and that they can be victim and are often targeted, but also against anyone. And I think they even took it further. They, kids of their generation and your generation are horrified of climate change. And you can apply it to that as well. It's another horror. I don't think it's all that far detached from it. And what they said is that they know that they have to stand up and speak out about that too.
I think there's also a tension where, you describe this at length in your book. We, thankfully, as American Jews, have gotten, on balance, to a fairly comfortable place here. And you also speak about your relatives who lived in relative comfort, if not opulence, before the Holocaust, and that tension between, are things good because they're good and they're going to stay good, or is the next disaster around the corner? And I think that takes us to Vilna or Vilnius. The town and the ghetto and the everything around it, I think, is a character in its own right in your book. And the place itself and the countries that have since occupied it or taken claim to it also have a complicated relationship with the Holocaust, which we'll get to. But what was your first time going there like?
The first time that I went there was, I believe it was 2003. And I brought all of my children and my mother, who was 85. And we went, it was partly a bar mitzvah trip. My son collected medical supplies for the Jewish Medical Center. And in 2003, Vilnius was really just post-Soviet.
Yeah.
There were shortages on all sorts of things. So they didn't have basic medicines at the medical center. And it was beautiful. We came in with these big bags filled with things, and the doctors were saying, "Molodiets, molodiets," to this wonderful boy. And it was a very different city. I distinctly remember walking with my kids down the street and realizing that we were stepping on Jewish gravestones, that they had used them for sidewalks, and the kids like jumping up and down, like, "What do we do?" Horrified by it. And this is what I mean by I exposed my children to things that, and of course I said, these are Jewish gravestones you're standing on. And when I think about it, my eldest was 15 and my youngest was, I guess, 7, something like that. Belle, are you here? That they were seeing these things, and they were entering houses. When we went to where my grandparents were from, one of my daughters, I think it was Eve, said, "Is it a mitzvah that we're here?" And Belle said, "They tried to kill us, but we're here." I exposed my little kids to this stuff. But they're amazing people, and I think, I don't know if it was my parenting, but they turned out to be very strong, opinionated people who will fight if they see something wrong, and I think that they learned from it rather than becoming paralyzed by it.
Yeah. There was a line in your book that feels like it relates very strongly to this. You said, "Collective memory is not ultimately about the past at all. The people it concerns are not those who experience the catastrophe directly, but those who follow." I love this message, and I think it's very clear when talking about the trajectory of your own life and your children that this very much has affected your ability to be an agent of positive change in the world. Unfortunately, I think that, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, as we always say, lots of different, I'll leave it very neutral, lots of different political figures have used the lessons of the Holocaust in very different ways. Are there any truly universal lessons that we can draw from this huge collective trauma that I think we're still making sense of? And what happens when it becomes such a football in that way?
Well, I don't know if I can be as diplomatic as you, although I am a diplomat, I'm not. Look, what we can learn from this book and what we can learn from the Holocaust, certainly, is that this should not be used as a political football, that it has been used, but it's been used in a way that is very manipulative. Very often to say that something is bad, they say that it's a Holocaust, or if they don't like a political figure, he's a Nazi. You know, I think you do have to be careful when you use these terms. However, I do think that it's in my mind, it's very, very clear that in the last, I don't know how many years, in the previous administration, I will be very straight, there was a tremendous increase in anti-Semitism and racism and attacks that are, you know, we can't deny that that happened. And when you have a leader of a community saying that, as in Charlottesville, there are good people on both sides, you know, we have to recognize that this is a dangerous statement. When we have leaders that are, I mean, it's bigger than Jews. You know, when we have leaders that are making fun of people with handicaps or are saying these shithole nations, this sets a tone that makes it possible for other people that have hateful thoughts to say them. It makes it legitimate. And that's why I can't be so diplomatic about it. I think that we took a turn for the worse by accepting this kind of language. This is not Democratic Republican. This is not about partisan politics. This is about an individual that, you know, that made it possible to say things and to use hateful language that we weren't able to use before. And, you know, maybe there was a movement that allowed this, but it's something that we have to recognize. You know, just as I say to my kids, and I would say, you know, with this book, you have to be vigilant and you have to call out hate. You have to call out injustice, because what else do we do? You know, we say never again. It doesn't mean anything if it doesn't mean that we stop it.
Yeah.
And this is something that was preventable.
I think it also dovetails with, Trump also made it a lot more mainstream. I think his Kellyanne Conway popularized the term alternative facts. And there's several scenes in your book that deal with this massive cover-up. In 1943, the Germans basically tried to erase all evidence that they had killed Jews at Ponary, and there was this mass cover-up, and I think, again, you put it very poignantly, Ponary offered jarring lessons on the manipulation of memory, because the history of the site since the war was steeped not in mourning, as I might have expected, but in political calculation, bad faith, whitewashing, and wishful thinking. How many of the sites that you experienced in the course of your research also kind of felt like that for you?
Well, Lithuania was interesting because over time it did change. You know, when I would return later on, there were no longer any sidewalks with Hebrew letters on them. You know, they understood that that was not acceptable. But still, at Ponary, which is the killing field where 100,000 people were killed, 70,000 Jews, when you would approach it, there were monuments. The first monuments you saw were crosses, but the monuments were talking about Soviet citizens that were killed there, or citizens that were killed there, when in fact, yes, there were more than Jews killed there, but 70% of it was Jews. And there was a reason why. This was a genocide against the Jews. This is very different. I mean, when people lose somebody, it's losing them. But A genocide is different than murder and war. And the fact is that they were meant to wipe them off the face of the earth. And it's very important to make a distinction between that. Not that there's a competition between who suffered more, but this is a genocide.
A lot of your professional career outside of your 7-year adventure for this book has been spent empowering the survivors of real conflict regions, real genocide. How do you think your own personal experience and your family's trauma informs your work with survivors from those communities?
It was everything. The reason that I did the work that I did in my entire life was tied to the Holocaust. My Aunt Mollie would say, you know, you have to work. You have to fight things. You have to be out there. The same kind of lessons I hope that I've given my children, that if you see injustice, you step up, you do something. What I didn't know until I started working on this book was that this was really also what I needed to do. When I worked with refugees in Kenya, for example, these were Somali and Sudanese and Congolese refugees. I remember seeing a woman come off the desert with a baby wrapped around her. I actually took a picture of her. But she had bare feet, and she was wandering off the desert into the camp. And what do they say? They're living in diaspora. And they literally had the same experience that we think of our ancestors. You know, we were slaves in Egypt. And we do that. It's a Jewish custom that we say, not custom, I mean, it's written. That we were slaves in Egypt, that we remember that we ourselves were slaves in Egypt. So my identity, my identifying with them was very, very close. And I thought, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, that I couldn't do anything about the Holocaust, but I can do something here working with them. But it still didn't fill that emptiness, that sense that I had something else I was supposed to do. And that didn't happen until the book.
I'm going to bring us back to the United States. I was very struck by, of course, the central character in a lot of ways in this book is your cousin Franya. We saw many pictures of her. She was a star of the Yiddish theater scene. And what happened to her, we won't reveal it, was the central mystery of this novel in many ways. And without spoiling the ending, I'm so curious why you chose the particular venue that you did to reveal to yourself what happened to her. So maybe you can walk us through that experience in Iowa of all places. Why was that the place, and what was that like for you?
Well, I didn't want to read the book, so I did the research and eventually found a testimony of a woman who was with actress Franya Winter when she fought the Nazis and when they killed her. And this was also in Yiddish. It was written right after the war. It was a testimony. And I thought, well, if I don't read the book, Mollie wouldn't mind if I found it elsewhere. And so I did find the entire story. I didn't know what it was, and I went off to Iowa to take a writing course because I was a political writer. I could write a speech. But I'd never written anything like this. This is completely different. You know, you're sort of cracking your chest open and pouring out everything. And I received the translation when I was in Iowa, and I thought, do I read it now? I'm all alone. Or do I go to my class? My class, the entire class was really white. I mean, like really white. They were from Iowa. If they weren't gray, they were blonde, blue eyes. I felt very exotic in this class. And when we spoke about our writing, we read each other's writing, it was very clear that they didn't know Jews. One woman was a rancher and writing about that in Wyoming. And people were writing things that they write about their lives, but very different than a woman from New Jersey, a Jewish woman from New Jersey. But I thought, this may be precisely the audience that I need to read it in front of, that needs to hear this. And so I just spoke with the professor and I read it to them, but I couldn't read the whole thing. And as I started reading, my eyes, you know how your eyes go ahead of you? And it sort of processes in the brain. I saw what happened, and I just slammed my computer shut.
Yeah.
And the class, they didn't know what to do. The professor said, "You can stop." And I said, no, I'm not going to stop.
Yeah.
And I opened it up and finished it. And there were just tears in the class and hugging me. And that's when this man who was a deacon said, "The sad thing is in 30 years, no one will know this happened." And I said to him, "It's still happening." Yeah. And it was a moment.
Yeah.
I think for all of them too.
Yeah. This book is so gripping, but it was a very tough read for me. And, I cover a lot of unfortunate things that happen in the world, but I definitely had to put it down a few times. And I'm just trying to imagine you with small children, as the mayor of a freaking town, as an ambassador. What fueled these late night escapades down dead ends and not getting frustrated when it took weeks to get back? What kept you going through this project for 7 years?
I think it was Franya. It was a sense that I had a mission, and that mission was to give them back their identities, their humanity, their dignity. All of this had been taken from them. And you can't do that for 6 million people, but you can do it for your family and for people that you've loved your whole life. And so I would get into it, and I would hear the birds singing in the morning. It was just something that I felt that I had to do. And I had to do it for them. When these were playing, and I saw Franya up here, and I saw my grandma, I thought, this is amazing. I did it.
Yeah.
I did what I was supposed to do.
Yeah.
And that is an incredible feeling.
Yeah. We're going to ask for audience questions soon. I have a few more questions before we do, but your book really, the thing that keeps you going through this wonderful book is you do bring us from dark to light and back. And a lot of these things are very interwoven. And we just experienced, for those of us who have connections to Israel, they just went through this yearly cycle that similarly brings us from, you have Holocaust Remembrance Day, followed shortly after by the Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers and Victims of Terror, followed the very next day by a celebration of the state, which just turned 75. And this is very jarring, this pulling back and forth. And I think it also can make it confusing to figure out if we're on the right trajectory when we yes, we're doing bad things, but also we have this great, amazing state. And in the same way, do you think we're doing a good job collectively of both internalizing but then doing something about the lessons that you and others have made so painfully clear of this collective tragedy?
Well, I think as far as the light and dark, the juxtaposition, I spent holidays, I would usually be in April in Israel with my cousin Kiana. And so I remember, I do know that feeling of going from, the silence on Yom HaShoah and the feelings of the mourning and then the joyous feeling. Yeah. And my sense of it was sort of like Jewish humor. You can be in the worst situation with the worst tragedy and you're telling jokes. Mm-hmm. I have friends who can't get why we tell Holocaust jokes in my family. They're not, it's not that. It's to try to find some light to let into the darkness. Yeah. What is it that Leonard Cohen says? It's the cracks where the light comes in?
Yes.
Something
yeah,
like that.
I was thinking they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat.
Let's eat.
That was
right.
the one I was
exactly.
thinking of, but both work.
but so there is this constant, it is an ancient Jewish tradition,
Right,
I think,
right.
where there's horror and sadness and joy and laughter and horror and sadness and joy, and it's all mixed up. So it's not surprising to me that all of these emotions could be put in 1 week. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah.
The question about Israel now is a very tough question and is much more difficult to navigate. What are the lessons from the Holocaust for this? I think it's complicated. Yeah. Our lessons are fight hate, right? Or we say never again. So what does that mean? Defend yourself never again? Or does it mean, be a proponent of humanity and never again? What is that? How do you protect yourself? How do we make sure that this doesn't happen? And I think that it can go many different ways. And just as if, we don't know what we would do if we were there in Europe during that period of time. I always say, you cannot judge people because people made decisions that we have no idea what it means. It's kind of the same thing. It's how are we going to we have Jews who are tremendous supporters of democracy in Israel. I mean, the fact that the streets are packed. And I think those people are also fueled by our lessons. But believe it or not, I think people on the other side that are much more, what would the word be, hawkish, I think they're coming from the same place, but just a different angle, that we're going to protect ourselves no matter what. So you're asking me a tough question.
So well put, though, Meryl. Thank you so much. This has been really, really moving. We're going to take questions from the audience, or some wonderful YIVO volunteer / employee / whomever is nearest the microphone will help you ask the question. I'll just remind folks that questions are not statements that end in upward inflection. They are questions. So please ask Meryl the expert questions.
Park when Meryl was mayor. And Meryl, I did not know any of this about you.
Everybody says that.
And I read your book, like in one night before I went to sleep. I found it totally gripping. I, pre-ordered it, so I got it on the 11th, and I was done with it on the 12th. So I found it really gripping. What I, in terms of my own history, I grew up in Newark. None of my family died in the Holocaust, but the people who bought the house next door had like numbers on their arm and bought the house with the reparations that they got. My own sadness is how the Holocaust is remembered, is that it's remembered in a very narrow way, I think. It's made very particular to the Jews, and obviously you've seen it in a broader way in terms of immigrants, but there's certainly, I felt like until there was the actual slogan, "The Jews will not replace us," a lot of Jewish people didn't think they had anything to do with, the anti-racist movement in this country. And Germany learned more lessons. I mean, Parchman Prison is not on an old plantation in the South. While Germany actually doesn't have statues of Hitler and things like that. So if you would comment on that, I'd be interested.
Well, you bring up something interesting, the statues. In Germany, they don't have statues of Hitler. But in Lithuania, they have statues and plaques of people that they consider nationalist heroes, but killed Jews. Were massive killers of Jews. And there's a real problem with finding a way of dealing with that. What they do, I'd just like to bring up the statues because I think it's brilliant. In Lithuania, what they've done with the old Soviet statues is they created a park that you can go to view, and it's really interesting. And we should be doing the same thing with our statues.
I just want to say, since you brought it up, great points. We actually, the Forward did a huge project. Lev Galinkin cataloged every statue and monument to Nazi figures still standing in formerly occupied countries. Germany actually, unfortunately, does still have some. They do a much better job with Holocaust memory than a lot of places do. But if you're interested in seeing how these various countries are in various stages of dealing with that problem, there's a lot of work that's been done.
The Confederate statues, which are treated with way too much honor, in my opinion.
Any other questions?
I wanted to know how do you, let me rephrase it. we just celebrated Yom Ha'atzmaut, 75 years to Israel. The Holocaust survivors that you've known in your family and that you were in contact, how did they view Israel? Is that like, we did it and it would never have could happen today, or it could, Israel, if Israel was there back then, what were their feelings towards Israel?
Well, my cousin Hiena left Belarus and then Poland in '62 and went to Israel, and she loved Israel. She loved it. However, whenever Netanyahu would come on TV, she'd spit. But here's a woman that she loved. She would pound her heart about how much she loved Israel. And she built a beautiful life, but she still cried every night about her mother and her sisters and her brother. And, so they loved Israel. But they were, they were critical of politics. That's perfectly normal, just as we are critical of politics. They were critical, and if she were alive now, she would be horrified. But, this is how we live. We live in a democracy. We live in a place where we want to make decisions between different philosophical positions. And she certainly had hers, and it was beautiful. And she didn't like Trump either. She would spit with him.
I think there's one in the back also.
I also read the book. It was terrific. One of the things that I thought was so compelling was your personal journey and coming to terms with Mollie's influence, but also your discovery of family who survived. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Well, first I'll mention the memoir part of this. When I first, my agent is here, so he can say this is true. When I first handed in the book, they said, Meryl, we asked for a memoir. And I said, I'm not that interesting. And they said, no, you got to write it. And you have to put your feelings in it, which was even harder. So yes, it was not meant to be in there until it was forced on me. But what I was able to find people, and it was a miracle. The way that I found them, each step along the line there were synchronicities that you just can't explain. But finding this relative was an accident. And it was a nephew of Franya's that made it through the war. And it only happened because, I'm telling you, 6 years into this, as I said, you would look at the photographs over and over and say, is there another clue? I would look at the passport applications, is there another clue? And then I realized there was one postcard that I hadn't had translated. All the postcards that were found I didn't mention that. At the Memorial de la Shoah, somebody came in with 50 photographs of an actress and her family. And I translated, they were Yiddish and French. And the one Polish one I put aside. So 5 years into this, I finally find it and have it translated. It's the key to everything. And it makes it very clear that she had a brother who lived. He signed it. And I looked him up, and I found that he had died. But this was good, because France doesn't give you that information. So because he was dead, I knew he died, and he lived before he died, obviously. And he was buried in a place called Annecy, France, which is near Geneva. And I tried to find any hint of him. There was nothing. So I called the synagogue. And I was very lucky that the woman that answered was the Rebbitzin, who was from Canada and spoke English fluently. And she was the most extraordinary woman. She went to work for me. She remembered him. But at one point, she was calling pharmacies. And there was another cousin. She's calling pharmacies and optometrists in Paris to see if they knew of this man, in Jewish neighborhoods. She was really extraordinary. And meeting them was really beautiful. But, You know, the family, this concept that we have, mishpucha, of family being broader than your next of kin, really did happen in this book, because it happened with Serge, the man that had the photographs. It happened with the descendants of this man, Joseph Abraham Rosenrod. I met his granddaughter, and it was like we were meeting family again. Yeah. And so my family grew from this, and in many ways I healed, but they did too. And that was beautiful. That was a beautiful outcome of all of this.
Thank you so much, Meryl, and many congratulations on your book. One thing that I'm constantly thinking about is that, increasingly we're seeing reports that the majority of Americans don't really have any education or literacy on the Holocaust or even the memory of it. And as displaced people, genocide still continue in our global environment. I was wondering to what extent your book will inspire your work on President Biden's Commission on the Holocaust and the certain policy initiatives that I'm sure you'll be recommending in that report.
Well, I'm on the U.S. Holocaust Council, and that is the council that advises the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And on that museum, I'm actually on I don't know what it's called, but I call it the Genocide Committee, and the archives. And I also am working with YIVO, and I think that these organizations are really thinking about what is the best way to use the information that they have. I wonder about Holocaust education. My kids all had mandatory Holocaust education. In New Jersey, they mandated it maybe 20 years ago. And their generation, I don't know if they have more knowledge because of that. And it's also frightening to me that we're seeing more anti-Semitic acts, even in places where there is more Holocaust education. Right. So I don't know what the answer is.
It's difficult.
Yeah.
We have a question from online asking if you could speak a little bit more about your family's pre-war history in Vilna.
Okay. My family, my grandmother's family, that is her father, was a blecher. He was the guild master of blechers. That is metal workers. And we didn't know before we went to Vilna, but being a guild master is a big deal. And so they lived in a home, and so did the apprentices. And so it was a beautiful home, right between the Philharmonic and the Gates of Dawn, which is the key area of the old city. And they had, the way that they described it was a beautiful life there. They were very proud that they were from Vilna. They were, in fact, snobs because they were from Vilna. Their Yiddish, they felt, was superior. I guess everybody thinks that about where they come from.
That debate has not died, I can
yes,
assure you.
Oh, really? But they were proud of the art and the literature and the poetry and the theater that came out of this city, which was really remarkable. So they talked about that and what their lives were like there. Of course, they left. So the reason that they left was my grandfather was drafted a second time into the Russian army. But still, even as a little child, I thought about my grandmother, and I thought, how did she feel when she was leaving her mom? And she knew she'd never see them again. Or how did they feel when they would open up the newspapers and see 60,000 Jews were killed in Vilna, which was on page 6 of the New York Times. Yeah. But they could see this, and that's not answering the question of pre-war Vilna. But it's a beautiful city. It deserves a higher stature in the tourist destination of Jews, because I know people go to Warsaw, but there's not really anything there. In Vilna, there are buildings. There's no real Jewish presence. There's kind of a young, vibrant Jewish thing going on. Mm-hmm. But now the city is much more European, and you see espresso shops and bagel shops and macarons and things like that.
Warsaw's not much different.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
But it's what is a little bit different about Vilna is you do get a sense of the old world still. But they don't know that the ghetto was a ghetto. You know, in Vilna, their motto for the town, or their advertising slogan, is Vilna is the G-spot of Europe. No one knows where it is, but when they find it, they love it. And G, I'm thinking, you know, genocide, ghetto.
Yeah. German invasion.
Yes.
Yeah.
And all of the hotels they're advertising are in the ghetto. So there's not a real acknowledgement of what happened there. And there's no great study center there of Jewish history, the enormous Jewish contribution that Vilna made. There's none of that is there, but there are people that are trying to establish something.
Thank you, Meryl. I'm not a Jew, I'll get back to that. You made it beautiful that transmission goes through our kids. I'll get to the question very shortly. When I was a kid, I heard that my family had to fight the Germans and resist the Nazis. I thought there were two crowds, you know, the Germans and the Nazis. The Germans, you fight them. The Nazis who resist. I understood the day, and I was moved by what you said about objects, the day when I found at my grandmother's place a paper from the Kommandantur where there was the family name of my grandmother's family, and there was a swastika stamp, and this was written, Nicht Juden. I'm not a Jew. Had we been Jews, you know the rest of the story, you know? And for a kid to have this sort of transmission through objects, and objects being spread through books, I think is very important. My question now is, we touched upon universality of the message. You touched upon progressism, I think you would say that. In a world where you have all continents, you have migrants, and etc., can you tell us more, not what's about your next book, but your next fight, and how you spread, not just through families, but how you spread across communities on this sense of inequality, and when we have to stand up and resist what goes beyond partisan politics, what is unacceptable. Can you just comment on that?
That's a hard question. What is next is trying to get the message out that is in this book. I think that there's, the reason I wrote it was not just to bring their humanity back to my family, their sense of dignity, their, who they were. It's not just unearthing them, but there's also this message that you mentioned about that you have to take a stand when you see injustice, when you hear hate, that you have to do all of that. And I think that that's the message that I want people to carry home from this. And so that's why I'm going to be going around speaking about it. And I hope that people read the book for that part of the message. And again, it's a story of one person out of 6 million, or a family out. And I hope that that moves people so that they fall in love with her the way that I did, and are broken by her death and how she died. But really, in the end, the lesson is we have to tell our children, and we have to tell them the stories and be honest. And everyone will figure out what the right age to tell their kids is. I just talked. But that's up to a parent or a teacher, or I guess school districts decide in 4th grade or in 8th grade. But the message, I think, is very important. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that my children, that for their generation and your generation, climate change is horrifying. And so they need to be able to, as horrifying to them as the Holocaust. And so they need to take a step. And look, we have climate deniers and Holocaust deniers. It's the same thing. And so in their lives, it's important that they stand up and make a statement about that, but also always know that anti-Semitism is insidious, and that it's on the increase, and that they need to take care of themselves.
Meryl, thank you so much. This has been such a beautiful conversation. I believe, I'm not sure if YIVO has more closing remarks. If not, there's wine and books outside. So those are both things
We couldn't have said it better. Please join us in the hall for a l'chaim and to buy a book and get it signed by Meryl. Thank you both so much.